You have to understand something fundamental before anything else begins to change in your experience. The world you are seeing right now is not fixed, and it is not independent of you. It is not something happening out there that you are reacting to. It is something being shaped from within you, moment by moment, through what you assume to be true. Most people live as though reality is something they are entering, as though circumstances arrive first and then they decide how to feel about them. But it is actually the opposite. Your inner assumption is the starting point of everything. What you consistently accept as true about yourself, about others, and about life becomes the foundation upon which your entire experience is built. If you assume you are unlucky, life will continuously find ways to reflect that assumption back to you. Not because some external force is punishing you, but because your attention, your interpretation, and your emotional reactions are all filtered through that belief. You begin to notice only what confirms it. You expect disappointment, and so you unconsciously prepare for it, speak from it, and act from it. And in doing so, you reinforce it again and again. But the moment you understand that assumption is creative, everything shifts. Because if what you assume hardens into fact, then you are never truly powerless. You are always participating in the formation of your world, whether you are aware of it or not. The question is not whether you are creating, it is what you are creating through your assumptions right now. When you assume something, you are not merely thinking about it. You are accepting it as natural, normal, and inevitable. That inner acceptance becomes a state of being, and that state begins to organize your perception. You will find yourself noticing opportunities that align with it, or ignoring things that do not fit it. Even people will seem to respond differently, not because they have changed first, but because your inner state has changed the way you are being met by life. This is why struggle continues for so many. They are trying to change outcomes without changing the assumption behind the outcome. They want love while assuming rejection. They want success while assuming delay. They want peace while assuming chaos is more natural. And so they remain trapped in a cycle where desire and assumption are in conflict. But when assumption becomes deliberate, you step into a different way of living. You no longer wait for evidence before you decide who you are. You decide first and the evidence follows. You begin to say within yourself, this is who I am, not as a hope, not as a wish, but as a settled fact in consciousness. And the world, without exception, begins to conform to that inner decision in its own timing. This is not about forcing change in the outer world. It is about shifting the origin point from which your world is projected. Once the origin changes, everything built upon it must eventually reorganize. So if your current circumstances feel limiting, do not be deceived into thinking they are permanent truths. They are simply the echo of previous assumptions you once accepted without question. And just as they were formed, they can be dissolved and replaced by a new inner acceptance. Because nothing in your outer experience has authority over the assumption you choose to live from. And the moment you truly accept that, you stop being a prisoner of appearances and begin to realize you were always the source. Now let us go deeper into something far more intimate, something you use every single moment of your life without even noticing. There are two words that quietly define your entire existence, and yet most people pass over them as if they are nothing. Those two words are I am. Everything that follows those words becomes a command to your subconscious mind. It is not a suggestion, it is not a wish, it is a declaration of identity. And identity is the most powerful force shaping your reality. Before you were anything in this world, you were aware that I am, that sense of being, is the only constant truth you have ever known. Now consider how often you attach things to it without awareness. I am tired, I am stressed, I am unlucky, I am not good enough, I am behind in life. Each statement may feel harmless in a moment of emotion, but your subconscious does not judge whether it is good or bad. It simply accepts the identity you give it and begins organizing your experience to match it. When you say I am, you are not describing your situation. You are defining your state of being. And your state of being is what filters your entire perception of life. If you say I am anxious, you will begin to notice reasons to be anxious. Your body will align with that state. Your thoughts will circle around it. Your reactions will reinforce it. And soon what began as a passing thought becomes a lived reality. But the same mechanism works in your favor when you understand it. If I am is a creative command, then you are always one declaration away from a new experience of yourself. I am calm. I am chosen. I am successful. I am supported. These are not affirmations meant to convince an unwilling mind. They are identity placements meant to be lived from, not reached for. The mistake most people make is they try to use I am as a tool for persuasion, as if they are trying to trick themselves into believing something. But this is not about persuasion, it is about assumption. The moment you truly occupy an I am state, you are no longer speaking about it, you are speaking from it, and that shift is everything. You do not need to force belief. You need to settle into the identity as though it is already true. The subconscious does not respond to effort, it responds to acceptance. When you say I am abundant and dwell in that state, even if only internally, you begin to carry yourself differently. Your decisions subtly change, your expectations change, your interpretation of events changes, and because your inner position has changed, your outer experience begins to reorganize itself around that new center. This is why repetition alone is not enough unless it is backed by inner occupation. You can repeat words endlessly, but if you are internally resisting them, you remain divided. The real transformation happens when I am becomes natural, when it is no longer something you are trying to become, but something you are allowing yourself to be. And here is the hidden truth most overlook. You are always using I am anyway. Even in doubt, even in fear, even in limitation, you are continuously defining yourself. The question is not whether you are using it, but whether you are using it consciously or unconsciously. Once you begin to observe this, you realize there is no greater power to reclaim. You no longer need to chase identity through the outer world. You simply choose it within. You declare it inwardly, you dwell in it, and you let everything else follow in its own order. Because the moment you truly understand I am, you are no longer speaking about life, you are speaking as the one who determines it. Now let us go further into something that most people hear but very few truly embody, and that is the role of feeling. Words alone are never enough. Thought alone is never enough. What truly seals an assumption into reality is the feeling that accompanies it. The inner emotional certainty that what you are aware of is already real. You do not manifest what you merely think about occasionally. You manifest what you consistently feel yourself to be. Feeling is the language your subconscious understands most clearly. It does not respond to logic, debate, or analysis. It responds to experience. And when you generate an inner experience strong enough, your subconscious accepts it as present fact. This is why two people can say the same words, repeat the same affirmations, and yet live completely different results. One speaks from doubt, the other speaks from fulfillment. One is trying to convince themselves, the other is already inhabiting the state. The difference is not in the words, the difference is in the feeling behind them. When you assume something is true, it must feel natural, not forced, not desperate, not distant. Natural. That naturalness is the signal that your inner world has accepted the idea as real. And once it is accepted internally, it no longer matters what the external world is showing in the moment. The inner feeling becomes the cause, and the outer world becomes the delayed effect. Most people try to change their lives by changing their thoughts, but they ignore the emotional state that those thoughts produce. You can think positively all day, but if the underlying feeling is disbelief, lack, or separation, then you are still broadcasting the same old state. The subconscious does not take instructions from surface-level thinking. It takes instructions from dominant feeling states. This is why imagination is so important. When you imagine something vividly, you are not just seeing it in your mind, you are experiencing it internally. And when that experience is infused with feeling, your subconscious cannot distinguish it from physical reality. To it, the feeling of something is the reality of it. Whether it is happening externally or internally is irrelevant. So when you assume a new state, you must also step into the emotional tone of that state. If you are assuming love, then you must allow yourself to feel loved, even if no external evidence appears. If you are assuming success, then you must allow yourself to feel the quiet confidence of success already being yours, not as performance, but as inner acceptance. This is where many people resist, because they believe feeling something without evidence is dishonest. But in truth, it is the most honest act of creation, because you are aligning yourself with the cause rather than the effect. You are choosing to feel from the end rather than react to the middle. And when you persist in that feeling, something remarkable happens. Your attention begins to shift. Your interpretations of life begin to change. The same circumstances that once felt discouraging begin to feel irrelevant. You are no longer emotionally dependent on external validation because your inner state has already provided it. But this must be sustained. A brief feeling is not enough to reprogram years of conditioning. You must return to it again and again, not through effort, but through gentle remembrance. Each time you return to the feeling, you strengthen the assumption. And each time you strengthen the assumption, you move closer to its physical expression. Eventually, the feeling becomes dominant. And when it becomes dominant, it becomes your new normal. At that point, reality has no choice but to mirror what you have already accepted within yourself. Because feeling is not just part of the process, it is the creative signal itself. And once you master this, you no longer wait for life to change before you feel different. You feel different first, and life follows without exception. Now let us come to something that separates those who merely understand this principle from those who actually live it. It is one thing to have a moment of insight, to feel inspired, to briefly step into a new assumption. But it is something entirely different to persist in it, especially when the outer world is not yet reflecting what you have accepted within. Persistence is the bridge between inner assumption and outer manifestation. Without it, even the most beautiful state dissolves under pressure. With it, even the most unlikely change becomes inevitable, because reality is not shaped by occasional belief. It is shaped by what you return to again and again, until it becomes your dominant state. Most people give up far too early. They assume something once, they feel it for a moment, and then the moment doubt appears, they abandon it. They look at the outer world as if it is giving them feedback about whether they are doing it right. But the outer world is not a teacher in that sense. It is a reflector, and reflections always lag behind the source. So when you persist in a new assumption, you are not trying to force reality to change quickly. You are holding your inner position steady long enough for the outer world to reorganize itself around it. Think of it as standing firm in a new identity while everything around you is still catching up. This is where discipline of consciousness becomes essential. Not discipline in the sense of struggle, but discipline in the sense of returning. You return to the assumption every time you drift. You return to the feeling every time doubt arises. You return to the identity every time old conditioning tries to pull you back. And yes, old conditioning will speak loudly at first. It will present evidence. It will remind you of past experiences. It will attempt to convince you that nothing has changed. But persistence is not about arguing with those appearances. It is about ignoring them in favor of what you have chosen to be true within yourself. You must understand that the senses are the last to know. They report what has already been formed, not what is being formed. So if you rely on them to validate your assumption, you will always be delayed. You will always be reacting instead of creating. Persistence allows you to break that cycle. When you persist, something subtle begins to happen. At first, nothing seems different externally, but internally you become less reactive. The old emotional charge begins to fade. The assumption starts to feel more natural than the old identity. And that shift is the beginning of physical change. But persistence is tested most when contradiction appears, when what you see does not match what you assume. In that moment you are at a crossroads. You can either return to old interpretation, or you can remain faithful to the new state. And faith in this sense is simply loyalty to your assumption despite appearance. If you continue to return, something powerful occurs. The assumption stops feeling like something you are trying to do and starts becoming something you are being. It no longer requires effort to remember. It becomes your default way of seeing yourself and life. And when it becomes your default, external reality has no choice but to follow. This is why persistence is not optional. It is the mechanism through which inner creation stabilizes into outer fact. Without it, you are constantly starting and stopping, creating and undoing. With it, you are steadily building a new experience of life from within. So do not be discouraged by delay. Do not be distracted by contradiction. Instead, understand that persistence is not waiting, it is holding. Holding the state, holding the identity, holding the assumption until it hardens into form. Because what you persist in internally, no matter how invisible at first, must eventually become visible without exception. Now we come to something that most people overlook entirely. Yet it is the very workshop where every experience of your life is first formed. Before anything becomes physical, before anything becomes visible, it is first shaped within your imagination, not as fantasy, not as escape, but as the true creative space of consciousness. Your imagination is not separate from reality. It is the beginning of it. What you consistently live within your inner vision becomes the blueprint for what later appears outside of you. Most people dismiss imagination as something unreal, something childish, something unreliable. But in truth, it is the most real activity you ever engage in because it is where every outcome begins its journey into form. When you imagine something, you are not pretending, you are selecting a state. You are stepping into a scene, an identity, a version of yourself, and experiencing it from within. And every time you dwell in that experience, you are impressing it upon the deeper layers of mind that govern how your life unfolds. This is why circumstances always seem to follow imagination, not the other way around. What you repeatedly see within, you will eventually encounter without, not because imagination predicts the future, but because imagination creates the pattern from which the future is constructed. Most people imagine unconsciously. They replay memories, fears, doubts, and past failures over and over again. And then they are surprised when their external life continues to mirror those same patterns. But this is not coincidence. It is causation operating at the level of inner vision. The moment you begin to deliberately imagine, everything shifts. You are no longer reacting to memory, you are creating a new script. You are no longer bound to what has been, you are stepping into what could be, and more importantly, what you choose to accept as already true. The key is not just imagination, but immersion. It is not enough to briefly picture something and move on. You must enter it. You must feel it from within as though it is happening now. You must hear it, see it, and most importantly, live from it internally. Because the subconscious does not respond to casual thought, it responds to sustained experience. When imagination becomes vivid and emotionally real, it stops being imagination in the ordinary sense and becomes a lived inner reality. And that inner reality begins to reorganize your perceptions. You start noticing different opportunities. You start interpreting events differently. You begin to behave in alignment with what you have experienced within. This is the subtle but powerful transition most people miss. They think change happens first in the outer world, but it always begins in the inner scene. The outer world is simply the echo of what has already been rehearsed within consciousness. So when you intentionally choose a scene in imagination, seeing yourself already having what you desire, already being the person you wish to become, you are not escaping reality. You are constructing it from its origin point. And when you return to that scene repeatedly, it becomes more real to you than present circumstances. At first, this may feel like contradiction. Your senses may tell you one thing, while your imagination tells you another. But imagination is not meant to agree with current appearance. It is meant to override it. Because what is seen now is only the end of a previous inner action, while what you are imagining now is the beginning of what is to come. If you remain faithful to your inner vision, something extraordinary happens. The imagined state begins to feel familiar. And once it feels familiar, it begins to feel natural. And what feels natural within you must eventually take shape around you. So do not underestimate the quiet power of your inner world. It is not a refuge from reality, it is reality in its earliest form. And what you continuously inhabit within your imagination is what you are slowly but surely making inevitable without exception. Now we arrive at something that quietly determines whether your assumption remains fragile or becomes unshakable. It is the moment you stop negotiating with life, stop constantly checking for signs, and stop asking when will it happen or how will it happen. This is the point where you step out of mental struggle and into inner certainty. As long as you are focused on when, you are living in lack. As long as you are focused on how, you are admitting doubt. Because both questions imply that what you desire is still separate from you, still somewhere in the future, still dependent on external conditions. But the moment you assume the feeling of fulfillment, the entire structure of waiting collapses. You do not manifest by chasing outcomes, you manifest by occupying the end, and occupying the end means you are no longer searching for it. You are no longer emotionally reaching for it. You are no longer measuring your distance from it. You are simply being it inwardly, fully and quietly. Letting go is not giving up. It is not resignation. It is not indifference. Letting go is the act of releasing mental resistance. It is the decision to stop interfering with what you have already accepted as true within yourself. It is trust not in external circumstances, but in the inner state you have chosen to dwell in. When you assume something deeply, there comes a point where forcing it becomes unnecessary. You are no longer trying to convince yourself, you are no longer rehearsing it desperately. You simply are it internally, and that inner beingness carries a calmness with it. That calmness is the signal that you have stopped opposing your own creation. But the mind will often try to pull you back into effort. It will whisper that you must do more, think more, check more, analyze more. It will try to drag you back into the cycle of striving, and this is where many lose their alignment. They abandon inner certainty in exchange for outer activity. Yet the truth is, the moment you are truly in the state of having, there is nothing left to chase. The desire is no longer a gap in your experience. It is a fact within your consciousness. And once it is a fact within consciousness, the outer world has no option but to follow in its own timing. This is why overthinking becomes the greatest obstacle. Overthinking keeps you in separation. It keeps you in questioning. It keeps you in delay. But inner certainty ends the conversation. It does not argue with doubt. It simply refuses to engage with it. When you truly assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled, something subtle happens. You begin to lose interest in how it will come. Not because you no longer care, but because you already feel satisfied within. And that inner satisfaction is the point of creation fulfilled. At that stage, you no longer react to absence. You no longer spiral when nothing appears to be changing. Because internally, you are no longer waiting for proof. You are the proof in your own awareness. And this is the final shift. You stop living from the perspective of someone who wants, and you begin living from the perspective of someone who already is. And in that shift, desire is no longer a pursuit, it becomes a quiet knowing. So release the need to control the timing, release the need to understand every step, release the need to constantly check the outside world for validation. Instead, return again and again to the inner state of completion, until it becomes more real to you than anything your senses can report. Because when you stop asking when and how, and you fully assume the end, you are no longer waiting for life to change. You are the change itself.